Okay, so for this class, we're going to be talking about social movements. So, in previous classes, we've talked about the different uh, branches of government. I thought this class would be interesting to talk about now, political actors who, exist basically outside of the government, but basically seek to influence the way the government behaves, the laws and policies basically enacted by the government. And so to do that, I think it's important to have a pretty good understanding of what social movements are, what they do. Now, to do that, I'm relying pretty much on this text here, "Poor People's Movements" by Francis Fox, Piven, and Richard Cloward, which of course was part of the assigned readings for the class. It's a somewhat older book written in the late 1970s, but still basically considered to be, an authoritative text even now. It's a fairly long book. I asked people to read the chapter on the civil rights movement. I plan on covering that as well as covering the first chapter of the book where they pretty much lay out their theory of social movements. You can see the chapters are fairly long. There's only, in fact, five chapters in the book. The book's about 400 pages long, which is pretty unusual, I think, in a certain sense, that to have a book of that length of only just basically a handful of chapters, not even counting the um, introduction either. But anyway, so let's get right into it. So, what do they have to say about social movements, and how do they understand where social movements come from, how they form, and how they act, basically? So, Piven and Cloward are especially associated with this theory of what is often referred to as disruption theory. They basically suggest that the more successful social movements are usually those that can essentially create a crisis by, as it says here, disrupting the normal functioning of society, which can then force those in power to undress the underlying causes of poverty and inequality. So their focus on social movements also is basically movements of the poor. Hence the title of the book, obviously, poor people's movements. By creating a crisis, social movements can gain leverage and achieve their goals, even if they are initially marginalized or excluded from the political process. So they kind of lay out their theory in the first chapter of the book, which I'll kind of cover a little bit, and then basically, sort of apply this theory to the rise and fall of various social movements in the United States, basically from the 1930s through the 1960s. And of course, we'll focus on the civil rights movement. Now, one thing that should be said from the outright, right? These are not revolutionary movements either. These are essentially reform movements. These are groups, trying to pressure the government to make reforms. These are not groups that are trying to, overturn the government, create, again, what Marx and Engels called the dictatorship of the proletariat or anything like that. However, they, of course, very much influenced by Marxist theory, particularly the idea that, the economic forces of society obviously play a very large role in determining politics and political change within a society as well. And we'll talk about that and how they sort of incorporate Marxist theory into their approach. But they also talk about the various changes in consciousness that are important. Also, how people think and what are basically the kind of beliefs that people have to have for these social movements to form. So most of the following will be direct quotes taken out of their book. You can see the page numbers at the bottom of each slide here in case you're interested in looking at it. They say first, so what are the steps essentially to change consciousness? They say first, the system or those aspects of the system that people experience and perceive loses legitimacy. So people, essentially stop believing in the system. They believe that the system is not a legitimate system anymore. That the, what they refer to as the system more, broadly is the political and economic system. That is not a fair system. It's not a just system. It's not a beneficial system. That it's essentially crooked and corrupt. Um, and then they start to withdraw their sort of allegiance to this kind of social order because of that. Large numbers of men and women who ordinarily accept the authority of their rulers and the legitimacy of institutional arrangements come to believe in some measure that these rules and these arrangements are unjust and wrong. Second, people who are ordinarily fatalistic who believe that existing arrangements are inevitable begin to assert rights that imply demands for uh, change. Next class, we'll spend more time talking about rights and the various types of categories of rights. It's a little more expansive than you might think actually. But that's another important aspect of it. Too. People oftentimes, of course, are very uh, passive and apathetic. They tend to just sort of accept things as they are. There's no way I can change it. It's too big, it's too complicated, things like that. People stop thinking that way. They believe that there is a way to change things essentially, and this kind of leads into the third step here. There is a new sense of efficacy. People who ordinarily consider themselves helpless come to believe that they have some capacity to alter their law. So basically, I wonder if maybe you could condense it to two steps. One, people lose belief in the system, their belief in the legitimacy of the system starts to wane away. And two, basically, I mean, the second, third points to me kind of sound like the same thing. People believe that they have the power to actually change things. So they believe that the system is bad. They have the power to change things, and so that at least in the realm of consciousness, at least gives rise to these kinds of social movements. Obviously, you have to also consider, of course, the economic factors, the social and political structure of society as well, how well the existing political institutions are able to sort of incorporate people as well as respond to the demands that people make upon it. So, if the prior three steps or maybe two steps, explain what is required in people's sort of consciousness or belief system to lead to these social movements. Of course, social movements also have to lead to a change in behavior as well, right? So basically, a social movement forms when masses of people become defiant. They violate the traditions and laws to which they ordinarily acquiesce, and they flaunt the authorities to whom they ordinarily uh, defer to. And second, their defiance is acted out collectively as members of a group and not as isolated individual people. So you have people who are acting in a defiant fashion, but again, people also acting as a group, not just an individual actor. An individual person can obviously be quite, defiant also, but just individual acts of defiance obviously do not constitute a social movement. It's only when these acts of defiance are acted out by basically a large group of people. Now, even though they focus on social movements of the poor primarily, of course, you have to acknowledge that for the most part, the poor, they kind of single out, the poor in America also, usually tend to be extremely passive for the most part. This is probably true universally, maybe, but they do place sort of, extra emphasis on poor people in the United States. They right here, again, on page 6, the American poor have required less coercion and less in social security guarantees to maintain their quiescence than has been true in other developed countries, even authoritarian ones like Germany, and notably poor ones like Italy, for the guilt and self-concepts of the poor have kept them docile. So they argue that poor people in the United States are extremely passive, basically, for the most part. They say only under exceptional conditions are the lower classes afforded the socially determined opportunity to press for their own class interest. So, normally the, obstacles, particularly for poor people, to act in a collective fashion are very steep. It's very hard, obviously, to overcome these things. But the idea that less force, less coercion is necessary to sort of keep the poor in line, in some ways, it's obviously a very kind of sad, commentary on people. Basically, what they're saying, and we'll kind of expand on this a little bit more next class too, is that people don't really demand that much. They kind of are willing to sort of trade their obedience and sort of get very little in return for it. When we, next class, we'll look at the essay by Michael Mann more, who's a well-known sociologist, and basically talks about this idea as well, that rights are basically sort of, concessions basically made by ruling classes in order to sort of, essentially exchange for the obedience of the population as a whole. And the extent to it, the greater the concessions that have to be made, speaks to sort of the strength of people, the defiant nature of people that basically the ruling classes have to give up more in order to keep them obedient for the most part. What they're saying, and this is another point kind of echoed by Mann as well as frankly, by many other people, is that, yeah, poor people in America, it doesn't take much, unfortunately, to get people to sort of uh, become obedient. I mean, that just seems to be a very common, argument made by many people here. So we've talked a little bit about, again, the changes in consciousness, the changes in outward behavior, obviously. What then actually causes the so-called insurgencies to take place? So Piven and Cloward basically look at various schools of thought here, right? And they say there are basically two main schools of thought, right? One basically economic forces that create discontent among people, which is probably the more commonly known school of thought, as it says here. You know, uh, what they call pressures that force eruptions, basically meaning basically economic pressures for the most part. Or they say another school of thought basically focuses on what they call here the regulatory capacity of the society. Um, Basically, the idea that social norms, people's normal sort of social routines and sort of social roles that the people take on, that there's kind of a breakdown in that. There's kind of a breakdown in these kind of social norms that keep people tied to certain routines of behavior, basically, and that can also cause a rise in social unrest as well. Now, as far as and basically what they look at is they kind of combine both aspects together to some extent. As far as the idea of economic pressures, you would think then commonly the most common understanding of this is that the worse things get for people, the more economic strain that they're placed under, the more likely they are to erupt, as they say. But there is another sort of school of thought, within this economic pressure school. Let's say that the economic pressure school is one school of thought. You can then break that school down to two different sub variants here, or maybe even three. One says economic pressures get worse. Another one says, and this is actually highly associated with Tocqueville, as you can see here, is this idea of rising expectations. The idea social movements are likely to develop actually when things are getting better to a certain extent. But maybe not that much better. But there's actually some small marginal improvement actually in people's standard of living, but not as much as people want. So people, it's almost like people get sort of like a little bit of a taste of something better, but it's not good enough, and it kind of then incites people to demand more. That's actually a little bit different if you think about it than the idea that things are just getting worse and worse and worse. This line of thought says no, things are actually getting a little bit better actually, just not as much or as fast as people want it to happen. So that's one school associated with Tocqueville. Then you have basically the view of Marx and Engels, which is actually a little bit different also, right? People would normally think that, well, they're in this idea that things are getting worse for the working class, and that's why you have these eruptions of people. But Marx and Engels' view is a little more nuanced than that, let's say. So they kind of paraphrase it here. They say economic crises and the attendant hardship. This is also on page 8. And the attendant hardships activate proletarian struggles not only because of the extreme immiseration of the proletariat at such times, not only because of the expansion of the reserve army of the unemployed at such times, but because periods of economic crisis reveal the contradictions of capitalism, and particularly the contradiction between socialized productive forces and the anarchy of private ownership and exchange. So, in other words, what they're saying is that it's not necessarily the idea that things are always getting worse, but what happens is that the proletariat starts to realize that the capitalist system is kind of an irrational system. It's sort of governed by, or at the heart of it is this massive contradiction, as they say, between the socialization of production, meaning that for a production to take place in society, industrial, large scale production, of course, it has to be incredibly socialized. Think of all the interconnections that have to exist to produce the goods and services that we consume on a regular basis, right? I mean, think what goes into a factory to keep a factory running, basically, and all the things that a factory needs to keep itself running. Least of all, not least of all the workforce, but everything else, the raw materials that it needs, electricity, transportation, everything else that you could think of. I think it's fairly obvious once you kind of sit down and actually try to think about it. Um, and so on the one hand, for society to produce things, it's incredibly interconnected and intertwined with each other, not just at a social level, but increasingly now at really a global level, or at an international level at the very least. So you have this incredible socialization that is required to produce things, but the ownership of this vast productive capacity is in private hands. So you have millions, if not billions, of people sort of interacting in some way to produce things, to produce basically everything. But the ownership of these things is held by a tiny group of people, maybe like a few thousand people at in the entire world. This to them is a contradiction, of course. It's irrational that only a small group of people would have ownership of this vast socialization of productive capacity. And what they're arguing here basically is that as time goes on, the proletariat, the working class, begins to realize this. Why do we acquiesce to a irrational system like this, where none of the stuff would even exist if we didn't already have this vast socialization and interconnection between things? Why do a tiny group of people at the very top basically get to appropriate all the wealth that is produced by this, when they're not the ones doing the work either? So that's I would say a little bit of a more sophisticated view than just the idea that, well, workers are poor and so they have sort of a reaction against that. So they take some issue with this argument, though. In the simplest terms, the idea that things get worse, so economic conditions get worse, so that makes people react against it. They argue quite correctly, I think, is that this view presumes that there are sort of periods where nothing is really happening, as it says here. The major flaw in our view, in the work of all what they call the pressure theorists, and again the economic pressure theorists, is their reliance on an unstated and incorrect assumption that economic change or structural change is extraordinary, that stability and the willing consensus it fosters are the usual state of affairs. So what they're saying basically is that, well, there's constant economic change. So if economic change was a cause of social movements, then you should constantly be seeing social movements happen. But in fact, they're fairly rare. And they're right, of course. The economy is not static. It is constantly going through motions and dynamics and processes and things like that. They then qualify that view a little bit and say, well, maybe extremely rapid economic change is a cause of these social movements, which seems to make sense as well. Yes, change is a constant thing, but there are periods of times where change takes on a vastly accelerated quality to it. The economic changes start happening at a very rapid rate, and then they also maybe tend to be very expansive as well, sort of bringing in more and more people who are affected by these economic changes as well. So that's the so-called economic pressure school of thought. The other school of thought is this idea of social disorganization. The other major set of theoretical perspectives, they say, on popular uprising emphasizes the breakdown of the regulatory capacity of social institutions as a principal factor leading to civil strife. More specifically, economic change may be so jarring as to virtually destroy the structures and routines of daily life. So now they're saying that, again, economic change can sort of break up people's normal habits. We all kind of fall into a routine for the most part, right? We get used to maybe not the exact same thing every single day, but we more or less get adapted to some kind of regular daily routine. But then there are things that happen that interrupt that, and they argue that sort of a continuous disruption of that may be a factor that sort of leads to these social movements happening as well. They go on to say, thus, a Marxist interpretation of protest would acknowledge the significance of both relative deprivation. Again, the other term that they use for economic pressure, basically, and social disorganization. So they argue that the Marx interpretation kind of brings both schools together to a certain extent, treating these, however, not as historically generalizable causes of uprisings, but as symptoms of historically specific contradictions in capitalist society. So here, once again, emphasizing this notion of contradiction as well. They go on to say, still, neither the frustrations generated by the economic change nor the breakdown of daily life may be sufficient to lead people to protest their travails. Ordinarily, when people suffer such hardships, they blame God or they blame themselves. So, still, even with all these factors playing a role, people are still more likely basically to blame themselves. They say. For a protest movement to rise out of these traumas of daily life, people have to perceive the deprivation and disorganization they experience as both wrong and subject to redress. They also argued that there is, which is kind of a restatement of what they've already said. They also emphasize that maybe there's a sort of a competition among elites as well. The different elite groups within a society may have some motivations, sort of sow discontent and kind of exploit that discontent among people uh, as well. Then they look into how political institutions specifically contribute to protest. Basically, what they're saying here is, how do political institutions play a role in sort of diffusing the pressures, basically diffusing the discontent that boils up among people, and how can it sort of absorb that discontent into the regular political process to essentially preclude or block the formation of these social um, movements. And the failure of political institutions then to do so then becomes another major causal factor as well. So whether it's a question of economic pressure placed upon people, or it's the social disorganization that people face, even if those factors are present and fairly strong, if the political institutions are strong enough to kind of absorb that, then that will essentially again block the formation of these social movements. So that they have to then sort of focus on how the political institutions work, and if the political institutions are functional enough to do that. Essentially, then dysfunctional political institutions would be less willing, would be less likely to do that, and thus lead to a explosion essentially. They rate defiance is first expressed in the voting booth. So basically, people's most likely response to being upset or discontented about things is to express it through voting. They don't like the current government, they'll vote the current government out and vote in a new government, which of course we see many examples of that. But people have to believe then that voting is a meaningful act, right? What happens if people sort of lose um, faith in that, or they again start to believe that voting doesn't really matter, that no matter who you're going to vote for, you're basically going to end up with the same type of person. They write, it is significant that the franchise, meaning the voting franchise, was extended to white working class men at a very early period in the history of the United States, and that a vigorous system of local government developed out of that. So basically, they're saying that, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons maybe why white working class voters tend to be much more, in many ways, conservative, is because there's not a long history of working class struggle against the government being, sort of on the outside of things. Again, next class we'll talk about that a little bit more, but outside of the United States, working class people got the right to vote relatively late. In some cases, not until, the latter part of the 19th century or even after. So being sort of, outside of the political process, not being able to participate in the political process, obviously then sort of, feeds into this kind of, radical, um, energy in a lot of ways. When you extend the right to vote to people, then you, in some ways, make people much more conservative, right? They're much more likely to sort of work within the normal political channels. Um, they give I think an interesting hint here. They say look for large shifts in voting patterns as an indication, basically, that the political system is starting to break down. When you see groups of people, maybe rapidly shifting from one election to another. We oftentimes break elections down, right, into different social demographic groups, their age, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their occupation, their income level, all these other things. And maybe we could talk about that in a future class. We haven't talked about that so much so far. But they're saying, when you see a large shift, that can mean an indication, basically, that people are starting to lose their faith in the political process, basically. Now, again, I mean, I'll just mention it. I mean, we could look at it in a more systematic way in a future class. But I mean, one thing, of course, that stands out from the most recent election was that there was a large shift of voters, particularly among um, Latino voters in the 2024 election. A large number of Latino voters voted for Trump, who had, prior elections had voted for the Democrats, basically, particularly among Latino men as well. So that would be, one example of a kind of shift in voting, you know, be behavior. I mean, I've kind of actually followed that for the last couple of elections, and actually in every election, um, I mean, Trump's vote numbers among Latino voters was, I mean, something around like 30% even in 2016, which is still kind of high when you think about it, considering the kind of, you know, rhetoric that Trump uses. And then that number was even higher in 2020, around 40%. And by some indications, even higher in the 2024 election. So Trump has made, successful inroads into that group of voters basically in every single election. So something to keep in mind, obviously, as well as obviously focusing on other demographic groups as well. I mean, some things like white working class voters voting for the Republican Party. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's been basically a thing now since like the 1980s. Since I think Ronald Reagan, you basically see most white working class voters vote for the Republican candidate. Though I'm not sure if every single election. I think at least most, if not every single election. They also mentioned, the important historical role that's third parties play in elections as well. So they mentioned the Socialist Party. They write here that in 1901 the Socialist Party came together as a coalition of many of these groups, basically other socialist groups. And by 1912 it had elected 1,200 party members to local public office in some 340 cities and towns, including the mayor's office in 73 cities. It's quite a lot, actually, when you think about it. To think that there were, at one point, 73 socialist mayors in the United States. Now, obviously, their ability to capture office at a national level is quite limited, basically non-existent. But it does at least, say that third parties can play an important role, influencing things and even win office at a local level. I would also add to that that third parties have historically played a role in pressuring at least one of the two major parties to shift on certain areas. Mostly in the case of the Democratic Party, whether it's the People's Party, the Progressive Party, maybe even the Socialist Party to a certain extent. Even if they've unable to win office on a in a national level or on a national level, have historically been able to pressure these parties to adopt certain aspects of their programs, basically. Again, this idea of ruling class strategies is an idea associated with Michael Mann, who we'll talk a little bit more about next class. Of course, the role of political leaders matter as well. The idea, the ability rather of certain candidates to sort of generate a mass movement of support of people behind them as well. So they quote Engels here also. So Engels writes, it has been discovered that the political institutions in which the domination of the bourgeoisie is organized offer a fulcrum by means of which the proletariat can combat these very political institutions. In other words, what they're setting up here is this idea that socialist parties have in many other countries, not so much in the United States, but have been able to play a significant role in mainstream politics. Also, I mentioned this in earlier class, but in many other countries, the Socialist Party, even a Communist Party, many countries even have both a Socialist and a Communist Party, basically function just like a regular political party. And you could say even that's somewhat maybe a critique of those parties as well, that they do essentially become just like a regular political party, but they do exist and they do play that role. And during the latter part of the 19th century, there was a growing movement, particularly in Germany, where there is an idea that socialism could be sort of enacted through a parliamentary majority, that you could elect to govern a majority of socialists who would then use that capture of political power to sort of enact socialism that way. Obviously, that did not happen, but that was the belief that people had, at least in the 19th century, late 19th century. And it is worth pointing out that that was kind of in some regards, at least, sort of the original version of how a socialist revolution was supposed to take place. The idea, which eventually became sort of the more dominant idea, the idea of the sort of following the model of the Russian revolution of a seizure of power in that way by a revolutionary group, essentially overturning the government, not through elections or a majority, became the dominant you know mode of revolutionary politics. But that was not actually the original idea. Anyway, to go on, the Social Democrats have participated in the elections to the various diets, meaning again the parliaments, to municipal councils, and to industrial courts, wherever the proletariat could secure an effective voice. The occupation of these electoral strongholds by the bourgeoisie has been contested. Consequently, the bourgeoisie and the government have become much more alarmed at the legal than at the illegal activities of the Labor Party, dreading the results of elections far more than they dread the results of rebellion. So then they go on to ask, why do people, in some cases, protest in a nonviolent way, and why do they protest in a violent way? Why, in others, do people sometimes strike and other times boycott, loot, or burn? And the somewhat fairly obvious answer, maybe to that, maybe that's an obvious answer, is that, well, I mean, it depends on their ability to do so. As they point out, if you're a mass of unemployed people, then obviously you can't go on strike, obviously. So your ability, so the kind of political protest that you adopt is obviously also going to be largely determined by your social situation also. We also, of course, point out that lower class protests are usually not violence, but often have violence used against them. So they usually start out as nonviolent movements, but if they turn violence, usually, violence being basically enacted by the state, or, in some cases by by the companies or the employers. Um, Okay, well, let me try to speed things up a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to actually get to talking about, the civil rights movement. Also, here they basically just say that yes, people don't, they understand things in a very, direct way. Of course, they don't just look at it, the theoretical, constructs like, monopoly capitalism. What they experience is the day to day life in the, the factory, and what that experience is like, basically. Institutional patterns shape mass movements by shaping the collectivity out of which protests can arise. Institutional life aggregates people or disperses them, molds group identities, and draws people into settings within which collective action can erupt. Thus, factory work gathers men and women together, educates them in a common experience, and educates them to the possibilities of cooperation and collective action. Again, Marx and Engels, but with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses, its strength grows, and it feels its strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. Institutional roles determine the strategic opportunities for defiance, for it is typically by rebelling against the rules and authorities associated with their everyday activities that people protest. So again, people again cannot defy institutions that they do not have access to. And basically, they want to examine the disruptive effects of institutions on different forms of mass defiance, and then to examine the political reverberations of those disruptions. All right, so I think we pretty much got an idea now of how that works. Now we can sort of move on to talking in more depth about the civil rights movement itself. This is kind of, a diagram here, which to some extent, summarizes the typical, pattern of how social movements sort of come and go. Social movements are usually fairly brief. Also, they usually don't last very long. They emerge, they coalesce, meaning that they get stronger, they form a more definite identity. Then they have a tendency to bureaucratize, which means that they become more formalized. Now, this kind of goes against what Piven and Cloward argue, right? They argue the social movements are actually more effective the less bureaucratic they are, the more they kind of act in a kind of spontaneous fashion and a more disruptive fashion, the more effective they usually are. It's actually when they become more organized and more, formalized that they start to lose their vitality and energy, if you want to call it. And this usually then leads to, as it says here, success, failure, co-optation, repression, or go mainstream, and then their decline. So it's interesting that all these pathways all basically sort of lead to the same inevitable result. Even if they succeed, they still kind of fail. Even if they accomplish basically what they're meant to do, then they kind of lose their reason for existing. So they kind of decline after that. In many cases, they fail. They did not succeed in whatever their objectives are. Again, these are basically reformist movements. Also, these are not revolutionary movements. These are movements trying to get some kind of reform out of the government. Sometimes they succeed. Lots of times they fail. Lots of times they get co-opted. They become a part of the mainstream. I would argue you can see this kind of is what happened with the civil rights movement. And the focus on civil rights and the focus on racism and things like that. That has, essentially become a mainstream movement. Now, I don't understand why they separate co-optation from go mainstream. To me, that means kind of the same thing. Although I guess maybe there's some kind of difference that you could get out of that. To me, it means more or less the same thing. But that's what I was kind of poking fun several classes ago against this image of Nancy Pelosi kneeling in kente cloth, which I think is kind of a perfect example of how these movements tend to get sort of co-opted by the mainstream, and thus of course they sort of lose their effectiveness. What was once a radical movement, which would kind of scare the elites, scare the authorities, become sort of integrated into the establishment essentially. And of course, there are various other examples of that as well, including the labor movement in this country as well, right? I mean, that used to be something. Workers forming unions and things like that used to scare the shit out of people in this country. Going back to the 1930s. Nowadays, it's not that big of a threat anymore. Unions are very much, a part of the political establishment now, particularly within the Democratic Party. But sometimes they kind of play both sides as well, right? They do occasionally, appeal to Republican, political figures as well. The head of the Teamsters Union, spoke at the Republican National Convention, for example. And of course, in many cases, social movements are repressed, oftentimes using violence as well. You can see sort of an example of this from recent times. All right. Now let's get into the civil rights. This is what I asked people to read for this class. All right. So they say, what was basically the goal of the civil rights movement? They say, one goal was to secure formal political rights in the South, especially the right to the franchise, the right to vote, obviously. The other was to secure economic advances to, improve the living standards of African American people in the South and elsewhere, of course. Well, if that is the case, then you have very mixed results. On the one hand, they did win the right to vote, but as far as economic gains, they argue very limited. Again, as I write here, in retrospect, it is clear that the main victory was the extension of political rights to blacks in the South, together with a larger degree of black political representation in the northern cities. By contrast, economic gains were limited. Many blacks entered the middle class, taking advantage of the liberal employment policies of both public and private institutions, which the turbulence of the period produced. For most poor blacks, however, occupational conditions did not much improve. For many of them, the main gain was the winning of liberalized welfare practices to ensure their survival despite widespread unemployment and underemployment. That gain and the movement which won it will be, all right, discussed in the next chapter, which you could read. They themselves were important organizers in the welfare rights movement in the 1960s as well. But this is written in the late 1970s. Like I said, I mean, has that really changed that much? Not really, not significantly. I mean, yes, there are obviously many more, so-called middle class Black people now than there were, prior to this. But if you look at the data that exists on this, African Americans in general disproportionately have much lower incomes overall than white people do, and even other groups within the United States, other racial groups within the United States. So even though you have many more middle class Black people, and even some extremely wealthy Black people as well, you still have a significant number of very poor Black people living within the United States, and really not much has changed. Now, again, so going into what were the causes leading up to the civil rights movement, they focus on a lot of things. Of course, the economic, conditions matter. But again, this idea of this sort of breakdown in people's social routines mattered a lot as well. So they focus on industrialization within the South, which did start to happen more. I mean, this is a very long, chapter, like I said. So they actually start basically talking about the civil rights movement really right after the Civil War and kind of make their way up to the 1960s. So essentially, you have a condensed version of almost 100 years of history, basically. So it's not really until really the later part of the 19th century that you start to see the earliest. I mean, the United States as a whole doesn't really become an industrialized country until after the Civil War, and of course, most of that industrialization is concentrated in the North. I mean, the South, I don't think really started becoming industrialized to the early part of the 20th century. I mean, much, at a later point than did the North. But you also have, starting in the late 19th century, a mass migration of Black people moving out of the South into northern cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, and etc. So going back to this idea of a disruption of people's daily routines, obviously those things are going to disrupt people's daily life, right? If you move to another part of the country, that's obviously a disruption to your daily life. But if you go from working on a farm to working on a factory to working in a factory, that's obviously another disruption to your daily life. They say during slave times, almost all Black people, I won't use their antiquated language here, but were basically employed as household, or worked in the fields, or worked as a household servants. This was still true of 87% in 1900 and 80% in 1910. But in 1960, less than 10% were in agriculture and 50% in domestic service. So only about 25% overall, down from as much as 80% by 1910. Regarding migration, more than 90% of Blacks lived in the South at the beginning of the 20th century. By 1960, about half lived in the North. So significant, changes here. Obviously, in the course of slightly more than a half century, the occupational position of Blacks was transformed, and great numbers were redistributed from the agricultural South to the industrial North. Of course, it also factors during this period of time. Now moving into the 1960s, the U.S. grows into a superpower after World War II. You have, of course, several important economic, crises during this period of time. I've mentioned in passing a major economic depression, which happens in the late 19th century, starting about 1873 and lasts for about 20 years or so. Then, of course, you have the Great Depression of the 1930s. You also have the realignment of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party starts to change basically from a party of the South, the Southern segregationists, to the modern day Democratic Party now, which has strong support from African American voters. This next part here, refers maybe to this idea of rising expectations as well. As they write here, referring just to overall economic improvement, Blacks made their greatest advance between 1939 and 1951, when the income of male Black wage and salary workers rose from 37% to 62% of the income of male white wage and salary workers. So over that period of time, their wages were only about 37% of what white workers were were making, and by 1951 had risen to about 62%. So still less, but obviously higher, much higher than it was prior to that. So I said maybe that refers to this idea of rising expectations. People see things are improving slightly, but not as much, right? Not as much as they would like to. So it kind of inspires them to seek more change, basically. So the first sort of mass movement of the civil rights movement, at least in modern day times, at least in the 20th century, or during the period of time that they follow here, was the Montgomery bus boycott, which was lasted from 1955 to 1956. Um, I think everyone's somewhat familiar with this. This is Rosa Parks being arrested. This is really where Martin Luther King becomes a prominent figure for the first time. The boycott, and I'm assuming, of course, that people have uh, read this also. So if you haven't heard of it, I mean, they do describe it pretty well. Of course, I can only give a very partial description of what they talk about. But yes, I mean, black leaders in Montgomery, Alabama, organized a boycott of the bus service. That black riders would no longer ride on the bus, would no longer pay their fares to ride on the bus, to make the city authorities aware of how much of an economic you know contribution that blacks in Montgomery were making, that they were a significant source of revenue, obviously, for the public transportation service here. So how did this boycott last as long as it did? I mean, people still needed to get to work, obviously, so they organized carpools, as it says here, with 48 dispatch points and 42 collection points. It was organized and operated with remarkable efficiency throughout the year. Uh, City officials and white citizen groups, for their part, mounted a campaign of harassment. Riders waiting at the carpool, uh, dispatching, and collection points were arrested for vagrancy, for hitchhiking, and on other grounds. Car insurance was canceled. Leaders of the moment lived with constant telephone threats of assassination. So even something as innocuous as a carpool was met with significant harassment, um, and attempts to stifle it, basically, including threats of violence during this period of time. You can see photographs of it here. You can see people marching in the streets over it. Um, Long story short, obviously, the boycott was successful to some extent, but of course, at the cost of significant violence as well. I mean, this is the extent to which whites in the South were willing to go to preserve segregation here. And I mean, keep in mind, this is also after Brown versus Board of Education. So this is after the Supreme Court basically rules that segregation is unconstitutional. But just because the Supreme Court ordered it didn't mean that Southern governments were going to follow along with it, and even then continued to resist it. So this was essentially forcing them to try to implement the desegregation policies, which had essentially now become a part of the law as a result of the Supreme Court. So even with that success, though, of course, it brought significant violence, as it says. Uh, the reprisals in the wake of victory were staggering. For churches and several homes were dynamited, several shootings occurred, and there were many beatings. The atmosphere of violence so alarmed the businessmen whose economic losses were by then considerable that they finally brought effective pressure to bear on the city administration, with the result that 7 whites were arrested for terrorist acts and violence began to subside. The black movement of the post World War II period had staged its first major battle and won its first major victory. So it got so bad that even the white business interests in the city were basically saying, "Look, you got to do something about this. This is causing too much, chaos." Basically, then basically, the second big moment of the civil rights movement that they focus on is the efforts to desegregate schools. Now, again, much more, directly in response to Brown, but once again, you saw a significant resistance to this. And this is also an important part to point out here because it shows you how really unwilling both political parties were to get behind the civil rights movement. Nowadays, of course, the Democratic Party likes to act like they're the party of civil rights. Even the Republican Party occasionally does. Conservatives have occasionally tried to, even claim that Martin Luther King is a conservative, which is kind of funny because the leading conservative publications of that time were all, of course, opposed to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Um, but let's be clear, the historical record on this is quite clear that both parties were extremely reluctant to embrace the civil rights movement, and extreme amounts of pressure had to be brought to bear upon them to even get the slightest, even minor actions on the part of the federal government. So they right here, the Republican Party, the Republican platform said that the party accepts the Brown decision. The Democrats said that the decision had generated consequences of vast importance. In other words, just a meaningless, empty phrase. During the campaign, Eisenhower, who was the president at that time, declared, "I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions." Eisenhower, it turns out, was actually very much opposed to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Which you would wonder why. Why would you be opposed to the idea of the Supreme Court saying that segregation is unconstitutional and a clear violation of the Constitution? Stevenson, Adlai Stevenson, who was the Democratic nominee in 1956, in response to the question of whether he would employ federal troops to enforce the orders of the courts, replied, "I think that would be a great mistake. This is exactly what brought on the Civil War." It's an interesting reading of history. It can't be done by troops or bayonets. We must proceed gradually, not upsetting habits or traditions that are older than the Republic. Well, what is he talking about here? Like slavery, segregation, white supremacy. I mean, is that the tradition that he's referring to that is older than the Republic? And of course, Martin Luther King is, famous for calling out people who say, "Oh, we got to move slow, we got to move at a gradual pace," and things like that. And of course, he was proven to be right. And I would say you could also, people make the same arguments now about, oh, we need to move at a very, gradual pace and things like that, whether it's about healthcare, many other issues. In other words, the civil rights stance of the Democrats in 1956 was designed to regain the insurgent South. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the presidency in a few more classes. But, up until this period of time, really up until the 1960s, the Democratic Party really had to rely upon the southern states, to win office, to win, control of the presidency, for example. And we're very much, concerned with alienating voters in the South because of that. So what you get is, on the part of both parties, but maybe even more so during this time with the Democratic Party, you get them, kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth, as people would say. On the one hand, they sort of make these sort of empty rhetorical gestures in support of civil rights, but they're not really going to do anything that's going to, upset, voters in the South too much also. But that does have a cost, right? So Stevenson had won about 80% of the black vote in 1952, but he won only about 60% in 1956. The upward trend of black support for the Democratic Party initiated in the election of 1936 was broken. Now, going even further back, if you go back to the Civil War, black voters supported, after the Civil War, supported the Republican Party for a long time. The Republican Party was the party of the North, the party of Lincoln and Grant, for example. It was only in the 1930s where black voters really started to, for the first time, support the Democratic Party in response to Roosevelt and the New Deal, obviously. But by this point in time, we're starting to realize, well, if the Democratic Party isn't going to support us, we're not going to support them, basically. And this is why, context matters as well. 60% in 1956 is still a majority of, people. So you could point to that if you didn't know anything else and say, well, look, black voters still overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party. But then, of course, you would have to see that that's like a 20%, decline from what it was in the previous election. So, of course, context matters. Now we get to LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, of course, would later become president of the United States. But up until the 1960s was a staunch opponent of civil rights, as they right here. Again, you can see, the page numbers here. Ever since 1937, when he first entered the House, Johnson had voted no on civil rights 100% of the time. No on an anti lynching bill in 1940, no on a Democratic leadership amendment in 1940, eliminating segregation in the armed services, no on anti poll tax bills in 1942, 1943, 1945, no in 1946 on an anti discrimination amendment offered by Representative Adam Clayton Powell of Harlem to the federal school lunch program. Yes, in 1949 on an anti-Negro amendment proposed by Mississippi's Senator James Eastland to the perennial District of Columbia Home Rule Bill. The list was long, the record unbroken. Now, as it happens to be, he would later be the president that basically signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But purely, motivated by political calculations of what's going to bring him success. He wants to be, in power. He wants to be um, a president, and the only way, then to do that, he eventually comes to realize is that he has to support um, black voters. Again, as it says here, Johnson got the message. Victory lay in the cities. Victory lay within the Union blocks, the black blocks. Blocks meaning, large groups of voters that basically vote as one, basically. The immigrant blocks, the big city bosses with the independent voters, and if possible, the farm blocks. Though that was the last to worry about. Johnson saw that he who gets the South gets naught, meaning it gets nothing. LBJ saw that he had to get the magnolia blossom out of his lapel, and he coolly set about it. He would pass a Civil Rights Act. If necessary, he would pass two. And of course he did. But again, purely out of his own self-interest. So then they focus on Little Rock in 1957. The Little Rock episode went far towards polarizing racial, the efforts to desegregate schools there. The Little Rock episode went far toward polarizing racial sentiments across the country. At the time, both camps in the civil rights struggle probably drew comfort from it. For blacks and their allies, federal intervention could be defined as a triumph of federal power over sectional racism, meaning when the federal government finally intervened, basically something, literally sending in, the army basically to desegregate, to protect black students going to school. But they were very slow to do so. So this is what they mean. Both sides drew comfort from it. Yes, it could be seen as a triumph of federal power over sectional racism on the one hand, but on the other hand, white Southern leaders could not fail to recognize the deep reluctance of the federal executive branch to be drawn into the controversy, except under the most extreme conditions, thus suggesting that other methods of circumventing the courts might well continue to succeed. So again, the government is very slow to react to these things, and only did so when under enormous pressure was brought to bear on them. One result was that the court. They even point out that the Supreme Court even kind of moderated its views. While not directly contradicting Brown versus Board of Education, obviously, it continued to allow the concept of what they call discretionary pupil placement, basically letting school districts decide which students go to which schools, obviously, which continues segregation through other means. And again, as I talked about when we were talking about federalism in class, I mean, let's face it too. The United States continues to be a highly segregated country now. Even though the segregation is no longer a part of the laws as it once was during this period of time, it's now basically accomplished through market forces, right? These same market forces that economists tell you are so great and wonderful all the time. The operation of markets and economic forces, which allocate wealth and income to people, basically continues the same system of segregation or almost the same level and extent of segregation now as you saw back in the 1950s and 1960s. You see famous photographs here. You see the army guys, national, the federal government basically had to take control of the Arkansas National Guard as well to allow for this to happen. So now we move into the 1960s. So just as the Democrats were to regain the presidency in 1960, defiance by blacks erupted again on an increasingly massive scale. It was no longer mainly the white leaders of the South who provoked confrontations with the federal government. In this period, civil rights activists began to embrace a strategy of using civil disobedience to force local governments into conflict with federal authority. In reaction, white violence worsened, spurred by Southern leaders, especially governors, and acted out by police agents and white mobs. So now you see sort of a more radical stance taken by many of the civil rights leaders during this period of time, who were willing to take a more, provocative role in many ways. And of course, this then led to a further escalation. So the 1960s, brings even a higher level of violence in many ways. And of course, they focus on, the main tactic, of course, was the sit-ins at the segregated lunch counters in the South. They talk about some of the various organizations that are formed during this period of time. The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference around Martin Luther King, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. These become some of the preeminent organizations during this period of time. But at the time, organizations that are not very bureaucratic either. They're kind of sort of more loosely organized and sort of fitting with their view. So here you see a famous example of the sit-ins. Now this is illegal. These people are actually breaking the law just by sitting in at these lunch counters, which shows you how absurd the system was. It also kind of shows you how civil disobedience acted back then too. Just by doing this, you were basically engaging in civil disobedience. Nowadays, without such absurd laws in place anymore, it becomes in many instances kind of harder to engage in civil disobedience. To do so, you then also have to kind of up the ante a little bit more. Also, you have to kind of raise the stakes to a certain extent. They talk about SNCC here. The students who composed this group were animated by a belief in the efficacy of civil disobedience. Howard Zinn, a famous historian, described them as having a tremendous respect for the potency of the demonstration and eagerness to move out of the political maze of normal parliamentary procedure and to confront policymakers directly with a power beyond orthodox politics, the power of people in the streets and on the picket line. And Clark said that the SNCC seems restless with long-term negotiation and the methods of persuasion of the Urban League, and it assumes that the legislative and litigation approach of the NAACP had exhausted its possibilities. Of course, the NAACP being an earlier civil rights group, actually co-founded by W.E.B. Du Bois and various other black intellectuals in the early part of the 20th century, but it now becomes seen as more of a kind of more moderate group, I guess you would say. Again, there was no organization to monitor protest activities, one participant said, because the students were too busy protesting. No one really needed organization because we then had a movement. So again, going back to Piven and Cloward's theory that these organizations tend to be more effective the less organized they actually were. Instead of a single leader, SNCC has many leaders. Among these many leaders, Bob Moses, Jim Foreman, Stokely Carmichael, and John Lewis were perhaps the best known. John Lewis later became a member of Congress, important, part of the Democratic Party, but I think also maybe in some ways kind of serves as sort of a cautionary tale, right? I mean, John Lewis started off as, a radical in the civil rights movement, but by the end of his life, became just kind of another, garden variety politician for the most part. Thus, the essence of SNCC leadership appears to be this willingness to assume personal risks, to expose oneself to imprisonment and brutality. Its members play the important role of commando raiders on the more dangerous and exposed fronts of the racial struggle. So say this about CORE. CORE also typified this point. Although its money contributing membership rose from a few thousand in 1959 to 80,000 in 1964, the active members never exceeded 3,000 to 5,000 people. The point is that direct action requires only small numbers of persons, but these must be so highly motivated and involved that they are willing to risk the great hardships involved in direct action. Southern CORE typified this generalization. In short, the direct action organizations which developed during the civil rights struggle were cadre organizations, meaning, again, small groups of people who were very highly motivated, basically. And then focus on the Freedom Rides in 1961. Again, another attempt to challenge the segregation here. Now, people riding, getting on buses in northern cities, which were already desegregated, and then riding them into southern states where segregation continued to exist, and on many bus lines, and so challenging it that way. As a result, over 50,000 people, most were black, some were white, participated in one demonstration or another in 100 cities, and over 3,600 demonstrators spent time in jail in the first year following the lunch counter sit-ins. So only a small amount actually getting arrested, by the way, but a significant amount too. Obviously, you see a photograph of the freedom rides. Non-violent protests, but oftentimes met with violence here, as you can see. Many of the freedom riders were attacked when would get into the South, as you can see. Again, presidential response is very lukewarm, very tepid. President Eisenhower and candidate Richard Nixon, the infamous Richard Nixon, who was vice president for Eisenhower, and later almost won the presidency in 1960. As it says here, weighed the potential electoral gains and losses of intervening and deciding against taking action. So they, kind of, weighed the pros and cons of this and basically figured that they would be better off not involving themselves, not, again, supporting the civil rights movement. Kennedy decided otherwise, JFK, obviously, and it was that decision which has since been credited by some observers with having turned the election to him. His call to King's wife, together with a call by Robert Kennedy to the judge who had committed King to prison, caused little short of delirium in black communities throughout the nation. Within days of King's prompt release from prison, 2 million copies of a brochure condemning Republican inaction and exalting Kennedy's action were being circulated in the ghettos. But once again, Kennedy also was a politician, trying to calculate what was in his favor. So they also point out that until 1960, Kennedy was not a strong advocate for civil rights, and they go a little more in detail as to why they would make that claim. Black voters probably helped Kennedy win the election. So Kennedy won by very thin majorities in many cities across the world, which they attribute to black voters. I mean, we won't get into the whole theory of the mafia playing a role in this as well. That's very interesting stuff though, and probably plays a role in this as well. Although I don't think they mention this at all. And so Kennedy's response to this is to again do to perform what or to play the role, to play the function that political institutions normally do, which is to take radical actions and try to divert it into safer actions, more tolerable actions. So Kennedy's response to this was to try to redirect the civil rights movement into voter registration rather than taking on the issue of segregation in a direct way. Well, let's just get people to register to vote and redirect the civil rights organizers into leading these voter drive campaigns, which I wonder, Kennedy being a clever politician, if he also saw would benefit him also, right? Because you'd be obviously then signing up more people who would probably be more likely to vote for him. Schlesinger, who was a famous historian, Arthur Schlesinger, thought he saw in these events a parallel with the early years of the New Deal. A generation ago, Roosevelt had absorbed the energy and hope of the labor revolution into the New Deal. Likewise, Kennedy moved to incorporate the Negro Revolution into the Democratic coalition, thereby helping to serve the future of American freedom. So maybe, kind of maybe revealing more than maybe he intends to, but basically, showing how, political elites kind of play a role, sort of, diffusing and sort of, neutralizing in some ways, the radical energy of these movements. Now, this is a fairly long quote here. I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but basically, the attempt to sort of redirect the movement into voter registration was a big deal. It actually caused a lot of internal tension and strife, basically, because leaders were not all in agreement on this. Some, of course, obviously wanted to continue, to take the direct fight against segregation. According to Howard Zinn, who they quote here, basically the way in which they resolve this groups like SNCC is basically they split the movement apart. One part of the movement, focus still on desegregation. The other part would focus more on the voter registration drives. Just trying to see if there's anything here I really want to read out. I guess not. I mean, basically, just I think I pretty much just paraphrase that more or less. Well, I'll read this last part here. It remained then for the civil rights movement to continue to provoke mass civil disorder, for it was only when mass civil disorder erupted in its most extreme forms, sometimes not even then, that the federal government did what it claimed it did not have the authority to do. So that's a very revealing thing also. They're basically saying that, only when you sort of, again, put pressure on the federal government does it actually act. And the federal government say, well, look, this is, a states' rights issue. We don't really have, the authority to intervene here. But then you sort of, raise the stakes a little bit more. And all of a sudden they say, oh, well, actually, we do have the right to, intervene. It's kind of how it works, I guess. And then, of course, you get to Birmingham, and then Selma will be the sort of the last two, major episodes that they cover here. So Birmingham, in many ways, was maybe the most intense moment of the civil rights movement, and really what led to, in many ways, I think, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, or at least one of the major factors that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1964. This is in 1963. So from the perspective of SCLC leaders, Birmingham was an ideal locale to draw the battle lines with the Kennedy administration. So, deliberately an attempt to provoke the Democratic so-called liberal administration to take action. Because again, even by this point in time, very, hesitant to get involved and to do anything. For Birmingham was easily among the least racially advanced of major Southern cities. The Commissioner of Public Safety, the infamous, I would say, Eugene Bull Connor, had established himself as a bulwark of the Southern racist creed. The city administration had responded to the civil rights challenge by such actions as closing public parks, and the city had experienced a virtual epidemic of bombings of black churches, an omen of the violence that would surely follow if Birmingham were made into a civil rights battlefield. For just these reasons, the SCLC leadership believed that a campaign in Birmingham would provoke and expose Southern racism and extremism as no other campaign had. And it surely did. As you can see here, many iconic photographs taken from this period of time. If you want to, you can certainly find, video clips of this kind of stuff going on as well, although, it is kind of hard to watch, as you can see. But this is what was going, enormous, violence being thrown in the face of protesters during this. Basically just protesting against segregation. It did, of course, force officials in the Kennedy administration to act, trying desperately to avoid open intervention with all of its attendant political ramifications. The Kennedy administration unsuccessfully maneuvered behind the scenes to persuade and coerce civil rights activists and Birmingham's political leaders to settle. They brought pressure directly to bear on local officials, and they buttressed it in directly by inducing Northern leaders in business, industry, religion, philanthropy, law, and other institutional areas to telephone their Southern counterparts in Birmingham to urge them to intervene. Simultaneously with the killings and bombings in the South, the northern ghettos erupted in rioting as well. Rioting broke out in Cambridge, Maryland in June, just before the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In mid-July, riots erupted in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant. Then, as the summer wore on, the rioting spread to Rochester, Jersey City, Paterson, Elizabeth, a suburb of Chicago, and Philadelphia. It was the beginning of a series of riot-torn summers unlike any period in the nation's history. The black masses joined the protest in the only way they could, given their institutional circumstances. So what they mean here by institutional circumstances, again, this is a callback to what they said earlier. Since many black people in the ghettos were unemployed, you can't go on strike. So what do? You basically do whatever you can basically to make your voice heard. As King aptly said, a riot is the language of the unheard. In some part, rioting was probably precipitated by civil rights demonstrations in the North, where activists had also brought the struggle to northern cities as well. You see, just one of many photographs that you can see here. I believe this is a picture of picture of Detroit, I think, but I'm not sure. I mean, you could honestly find dozens of other pictures like this during this period of time as well. Then you get to Selma, which in many ways is the culmination of the civil rights movement, at least in the earliest form of protesting against segregation. On February 1st, King led a demonstration which resulted in more than 700 arrests. And on February 2nd, some 500 more demonstrators were in prison. Of course, this was known for the famous march across the Edmund Pettus um, Bridge, now actually renamed the John Lewis Bridge, actually. And you can see once again met by significant violence as well. So this is kind of where they sort of wrap things up here, and also start to wrap things up. Also, I probably won't get to talk about the other essay by Habermas about the public sphere. That's important as well. But in many ways, this was the culmination of the civil rights movement. It did result in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act being passed in 1964 and 1965, respectively. Um, and the efforts to eliminate legal segregation, I'll call it, was successful. To win the right to vote was also successful. Um, Other forms of segregation, again, as I've already said, continue to exist. But the other focus of the civil rights movement, particularly in its last few years, to improve the economic standards of African Americans in this country, as well as the poor people more generally speaking, as well, was more or less a failure. And it's often been pointed out that people kind of lose sight of Martin Luther King after this period of time, which I think is interesting as well. And in other words, if you follow the sort of the official narrative of Martin Luther King's career, it kind of culminates here in Selma, 1965, and then you don't really hear anything else about Martin Luther King until his assassination in 1968. So what did he do for the next 3 years? Well, once, again, legal segregation had more or less been overcome, and once voting rights had more or less been secured, I say more or less, of course, because not, perfectly, but the movement itself and Martin Luther King himself started to change and started to really more emphasize class issues, economic issues, to the point that King even renamed his movement the Poor People's Campaign. Poor, people's obviously choosing language that was not as closely tied to race, and it became in many ways much more of a radical movement. I mean, King became more overtly socialist in his rhetoric, started calling out capitalism really for the first time, started speaking out about the Vietnam War, for example. Read his famous speech Beyond Vietnam, which is a very powerful speech. Strangely enough, given I'll say strangely in quotes, given one year to the day before he was um, assassinated exactly 1 year after giving the speech. Very strange, to say the least. Which I won't get into more of that right now, but certainly read up on it. But it's interesting that more sort of in many ways sort of more radical phase of the civil rights movement is not really talked about all that much. But as you can sort of sum up the results of the movement, basically from about 1955 or so to about 1965, um, only partially successful. And again, this was at all points basically a reformist movement. There was never any real indication that this was a revolutionary movement or anything like that either. So they write here, the civil rights movement was not then the fundamental cause of this political transformation. The fundamental cause was economic change and the political forces set in motion by economic change. Still, it took a long, arduous, and courageous struggle to force the political transformation which economic conditions had made ready. So in many ways, the industrialization of the South, the rise of the United States into a global superpower, even the Cold War. Many people had pointed out that the United States is involved in this conflict with the Soviet Union, talking about how it's the free world and all this other stuff, and trying to draw a sharp contrast between itself and the Soviet Union. It became kind of embarrassing for U.S. leaders on the world stage to think that a good chunk of the country was still living in this antiquated racial caste system, basically. So some people argue even these kind of Cold War pressures forced the government to change. But they argue that fundamentally the civil rights movement was motivated more often or more often than not by these, changing economic forces. But again, it would not have happened also without the struggle on the part of leaders of the movement as well. Here, they're somewhat critical of the Black Power movement, which they say is seem to suggest is more of an opportunistic thing to just basically the personal advancement, maybe. As it says here, defined this way, the concept was especially suited to the ideological needs of a Black leadership stratum seeking to exploit the new possibilities for electoral and bureaucratic influence. The various concessions granted the movement none had a greater integrative effect than the right to vote. For activists were rapidly channeled into traditional electoral politics. So again, the success of the movement also undermined the movement at the same time. These voter registration drives and things like that were successful, but it also sort of led people into adopting more standard means of political participation, just going to the voting booth, in other words, rather than taking more forms of direct action. The extension of the franchise and the guarantees of federal enforcement of the right to vote held out the promise that blacks could finally make substantial progress toward full equality through regular electoral processes. They also go on to write the socioeconomic programs of the Kennedy Johnson years also helped to absorb and divert the civil rights movement also. The movement was not absorbed by the electoral system and the related government institutions alone. Many other institutions in society also began to admit Black people. Businesses and industry responded to mass unrest by hiring Blacks. Institutions of higher education, themselves rocked by the struggles of the period, revised their admission policies to admit more minority group members, some of whom had been in the front ranks of the civil rights struggle. So that's more or less their summation of the movement. I happen to agree with what they're saying. It was successful for a period of time. It did eventually sort of get absorbed into the mainstream, like really most successful social movements do. The only other alternative really is to just be violently suppressed. So this is essentially when social movements win, this is what happens. They eventually become just a part of the political establishment also. And I would argue sort of maybe epitomized by people like John Lewis, a handful of other figures, Jesse Jackson maybe you could argue as well. It kind of speaks to that. Other leaders like Ralph Abernathy later endorsed Ronald Reagan as well. So I mean, and he was a close aide to Martin Luther King. So yeah, I mean that kind of tells you sort of the rise and fall of these social movements. I think I mean this is what it is. These are reformist movements, and this is essentially in many ways the best kind of outcome that you could think of basically for the most part. It's interesting that to keep in mind that the economic aspect of the civil rights movement was pretty much a failure for the most part, maybe not completely, but certainly much more limited in its success than the other aspects of it. And I think overall it provides you pretty good overview of how social movements work and how social movements function. Obviously, there are other examples that you could focus on. This is obviously one of the key sort of model examples that you could use to basically study sort of the rise and fall of these various other kinds of social movements. All right. Well, so with that being said, I think I'll cut things off here. Next class we'll talk about rights. So that's it. So take care.